Gap report.
But Pat, you referred a little bit to convincing the leadership at Davos. And I often like to begin with this question just as a gauge of optimism in the room about the World Economic Forum. But 10 years ago at the annual meeting in Davos in 2002, what do you think the percentage of women leaders was? Take guesses. Okay, this is worse than my usual audience.
Yeah.
Slightly better than that. We were at 9%. 9%. But we're talking about a gathering that aims to bring together some of the most influential business leaders, government leaders, civil society leaders, media academics from across the world. And 9% is just simply far too low. And so we as an organization have been through a fairly long journey now over the last 10 years, and I'm just going to try to sum up quickly what we've been doing. We felt that 9% was too low. We felt that we were missing people who needed to be there. And so between 2002 and 2005, we really made an effort to try to integrate as many women who were in those very top positions of leadership across those different stakeholder groups. By 2005, we got to about 15%. And frankly, since then, it's been very hard to move beyond the 15%. There are only so many women that hold CEO positions, less than 3% in the Fortune Global 500, only so many women who have ministerial level positions across the world, only so many that have the top tenured faculty positions in some of the biggest universities in the world. And so we were facing this sort of external glass ceiling. And at that point, we decided to take 3 steps. One, start benchmarking, really try to understand what is the size of the global gender gap, and start providing rankings of countries. Second, engage the leadership at Davos and at other World Economic Forum activities and communities, both women and men, to actually try to resolve this issue or start making the first steps towards it. And then third, try to push that number forward. And last year, we introduced a quota at Davos for some of our business participants because we were having a lot of trouble moving that number forward. We were at 17% this year, so it's a little bit more progress, but we need to go further. So just in terms of the report, what the report is trying to do is understand the disparities between women and men on health, education, economic participation, and political empowerment criteria. And just a quick note on methodology, because the numbers are sometimes surprising. One, we're trying to look at gaps rather than levels. So we're just trying to see, regardless of the overall level of resources and opportunities in a particular country, how equitably are those resources and opportunities being distributed between women and men. Second, we're trying to look at outcomes rather than inputs. So we're looking, for example, at what's the outcome in terms of labor force participation, or what's the outcome in terms of salary gaps between women and men, but not trying to look at policy factors that could go into that. For example, weeks of maternity leave that are available in a particular country. And we're also trying to look at parity rather than women's empowerment. So we're not giving extra points to those countries, like, for example, Sweden, where there are more women than men in higher education. We're simply rewarding up to parity. And then finally, we're trying to make this index methodology stable over time and actually see if we can track progress in countries over the years. We've been doing this now for 6 years, and so we have 6 years worth of data. Let me just very quickly try to summarize a few of the findings. So the latest report, the Gender Gap Report 2011, highest ranking country, Iceland. Lowest ranking country, Yemen, and we were covering 135 countries. Now the top 5 positions were Iceland, Norway, Finland, Sweden, and Ireland. So by and large, a lot of the Nordic countries near the top. Now what's interesting is, using our methodology, what we can roughly translate these scores to is what percentage of the gap has been closed. And even the highest ranking country in the world has closed only about 85% of the gender gap. So even in Iceland, we still have a long way to go before parity. Now, the lowest ranking country in the world, Yemen, has closed less than 50% of the gender gap. So again, a very long way to go, huge disparities across countries. The other feature that we find is within the top 10, for example, you have countries such as Philippines, countries such as Lesotho, elsewhere in the top 20, countries such as South Africa, the United States at number 17. And both rich countries and poor countries can make it into the top of this ranking, because we're basically saying, regardless of your resources, how equitably are you closing this gap? Now, another of the global trends that we find is if we take an aggregate, or an average rather, across the 135 countries and look across the 4 dimensions, about 96% of global health gaps have been closed, about 93% of education gaps, only about 60% of economic participation gaps, and finally about 19% of political empowerment gaps. So for us, the message is we're starting to have women who are as healthy as men, almost as educated as men, and yet not part of economic decision-making, economic structures, political decision-making. So it's a waste of human capital. We also find evidence supporting that this is a waste of human capital, because we find very strong correlations between the gender gap and economic competitiveness, between the gender gap and human development, and between the gender gap and GDP per capita. I'll stop there, but lots of other things that I could go on about.
There's something about the U.S. being stuck at 17, because we're like 17th in the world in terms of representation in government. We're 17th in the world. I mean, what is that number? I want to see it go away. I know that, and move up. But Iris, you've been listening, as we all have, to just parts of the story of women and girls currently around the world, looking at where we've made progress and where we haven't. What is the business case we're making out of all of this?
Right. So first of all, thank you, Linda and NCRW, for organizing this incredible event. It's an honor to be here. And I also wanted to really congratulate the panelists and thank the panelists for the data that we have in front of us now. I don't know whether many of you know, but many of you have been in this area for a very, very long time. So you would be aware that 10 years ago, we knew nothing. I mean, nothing is maybe a slight exaggeration, but we knew very, very little. So, and as you also know, what doesn't get measured doesn't count. So now having the data available, understanding more about gender gaps and in different parts of the world, in different sectors in the US, and is just hugely, hugely important. So the question I think that Pat is asking is, so now that we kind of know what is going on, I think there are 2 follow-up questions that we might want to think about as a community. And that is, the one question is, so why do we care? And the second question is, so how do we move? How do we start closing those gaps? And if I may, I might spend a moment talking about both of those components. And others will have a lot to say about the business case as well. So first of all, I think gender equality just is a human right. And we should never move away from that. It is just a human right, and we should care about it for no other reason, but only because it is a human right. Now, in addition, we might care about what the effect of closing gender gaps is. And that, of course, is a very important question because resources are scarce. So take an example that now is actually used in about 30 countries of the world, where NGOs or governments give parents money to send their daughters to school. So cash transfer programs to send their daughters to school, which is actually a very effective way to increase the enrollment rate of girls. But that money is not available for other things, right? And so one of the questions that we have to ask ourselves is this also good for development? Is it also good for society? You know, what is the return on investment of spending $100, you know, on girls in school, for example, as compared to $100 on providing cleaner water in the world? And these, you know, so that's why we wonder about the business case and that question. And so my answer to that is positive, but not quite as enthusiastic as you might expect me to be. And so let me first start a bit with the kind of the skepticism. I do think that case has been oversold. And I don't think we do ourselves a service by overselling the evidence that we have. So evidence-based reasoning everywhere in the world, but also for our question, is super, super important. So for example, going back to the water question, which might not, immediately, but you might not immediately think has gender components, that's actually a very effective way to improve children's health. And almost coincidentally, it turns out that in particular, it has strong effects on baby girls' health, because research evidence from India suggests that many mothers breastfeed their daughters less long than their sons. And that has to do with a complex array of issues that I'll talk about in a moment, and kind of how we can fix some of these issues, but it is a fact. And so baby girls are exposed to dirty water much earlier than baby boys, and therefore are much more likely to die, adding up to the staggering and really awful number of around 4 million women and girls missing every year. So you can add up the numbers, how much that is over a lifetime. So yes, there's evidence that if you invest in women and girls, and now let me focus on women, women are more likely to use those money to the benefit of their families. So they're more likely to invest that money into the health of their children. But for example, on the education, it's already more complex, where there's actually evidence that fathers also care about the education of their sons and their daughters. So there's some evidence suggesting, yes, women spend the money more wisely than men, but I don't think, honestly, we can hang our hat on the business case only when we think about development. Now, another perspective on the business case is, does business, in this country and other countries, care about gender equality? And I think that's really been a very interesting and hopeful development in past years, where the evidence is increasingly strong that gender diverse teams outperform homogeneous teams. The data that we've heard about earlier, that more women graduate from college than men, so the talent pool is increasingly female. So business can't afford to forego the better quarter or so of the talent. And the decreasing fertility rates, particularly in the developed world, where we know we can't replenish the labor force unless we become more inclusive. So I think there is absolutely a business case for business to worry about gender equality that I think is stronger now than it has been 10 years ago. And there is somewhat also of a business case in terms of development, but that's just really a hard question to get right.
You have raised really what are the critical issues we're here to talk about. I mean, the data is here, we can look at it, we can analyze it. How are we using it for policy implications? And Ginny, to come back to you, because of your work before the World Bank was at UNDP and worked in development, how do you respond to the data? And is it evidence-based for continuing to invest in development?
Well, I think that the evidence is incredibly important. And I think that an important shift that I've seen over time is the shift in the, if you like, the gender discourse from a reliance on advocacy to a much greater reliance on evidence. But it requires enormous investments. And so what the World Bank, and with a number of partners around the world, is investing in now are these careful impact evaluations in a number of countries. So for example, in Africa, we have something called the Africa Innovation Gender Lab. So what we're doing there, for example, with respect to female farmers. So in Africa, much of the agriculture is done by women. For a variety of reasons, they do tend to be less productive than men, and that's due to less access to land, less access to inputs, less access to markets. And we know that when access to those inputs is equalized, productivity and output can go up by between 5 and 25%. So there's careful studies that show that. However, we don't know the best way to overcome those obstacles. So is the best way to overcome those obstacles through employing women to provide the extension services? Is it because of the way in which the information is provided? Is it through providing cell phones? There's a whole range of interventions which are plausible, but given scarce resources, we need a much better sense about what makes a difference and why. And so I think that continuing to invest in these careful evaluations is incredibly important. So in Africa, with this Gender Innovation Lab, we have some 17 ongoing at the moment, 13 planned. There's a lot which are being done by various academics around the world. But then the trick, of course, is then to link it to the policy dialogue. It's not research for the sake of research. It's very much, if you like, action research. And we need to go beyond what's in, if you like, a global report and then bring that to the Minister of Agriculture in the particular country to explain or discuss, the findings and to see what we can move on from there. So I think in a number of circumstances there will be important effects and important impacts, but in the end it requires very kind of careful analysis certainly at the national level and often at lower levels of discussion as well.